I got the blues, I got the blues, I got the Whisper Cotton Mill Blues. This is what folk musician Peter Seeger sang at the end of a refrain denouncing the working conditions in the textile mills of North Carolina. American composer Frederick Jeske meditated on that blues in one of his most appealing works for piano. This piece begins with an ostinato that imitates the hammering noise made by a textile machine, after which a fragment of the blues melody rises above the ostinato. Let's hear a bit more about it from pianist Emanuele Arciuli, the musician who played the fragment we just listened to. Arciuli is a leading concert performer of American music, and for many years he was a friend of Jeske. Jeske passed away in Italy, in Montiano, in June 2021.
In the late 70s, Frederick Jeske composed a collection of 4 North American ballads. The last one, and perhaps the most famous, is Winsboro Cotton Mill Blues, inspired to a song that in fact was sung by workers of the cotton mill in North Carolina. The blues is basically this and you can hear through the whole piece. In the very beginning, for instance, the 3 first notes are also in the clusters. And of course, in the middle of the piece, in the central section is etc., etc. And then also there is a very complex counterpoint with all these notes. And at the end of the piece, we have, in fact, the real blues. Etc., etc. And also in the very end, we have this. So the 3 notes of the theme.
This masterpiece dates 1979 and uses a superb technique of thematic elaboration, and it is certainly not the only blues written by a classical composer. Remaining in the USA, Aaron Copland's 4 piano blues are one of the most famous examples. In the mid-20s, Copland was drawn to the rhythms of jazz and blues, and in 1927 he dedicated a well-known article to this music. It is no coincidence that at his audition to be accepted as a pupil of the great composition teacher Nadia Boulanger, Copland wrote a piece, a composition, titled Jazzy. Coming back to the four-piano blues, let's concentrate on the second one, which Copland wrote in 1926. The score, the indication is soft and languid. I asked pianist Marco Fumo, a specialist in classical music influenced by the African-American tradition, to perform the first page of this composition for us. There are some unmistakable bluesy passages like this one. But above all, as was the case with Jeske, Whisper Cat on Male Blues, what interests Copland is the transfiguration of the blues, the sublimation of the blues. One of the most poetic elaborations of Mississippi Delta singers' tradition by a classical composer can be found in the last blues written by Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco. I say the last blues because this Italian composer had already written blues pieces before his departure for the USA. The second movement of the 1928 piano sonata contains no less than two blues. Even the three vocalizzi in the modern style, which date to the same 1928, are decorated with blue notes. But the blues that Castelnuovo Tedesco included in his last unfinished work, Appunti, Preludi e Studi per chitarra 1968, is the utmost sublimation of an American tradition that he knew directly and of which, in some ways, he had been a part for many years. All that remains of the blues is the tempo, shambling, lazy, tired. It sounds influenced by Gershwin, and indeed Castelnuovo Tedesco knew the composer of Rhapsody in Blue well. In his memoirs, he says about his own composition Recuerdo 1941. Despite its Spanish title, it has a New York character. The music is carefree and indolent, somehow in the manner of Gershwin. Surely enough, George Gershwin is also part of this group of musicians, and not so much because he was a classical composer who also wrote blues, but because, not unlike Jeske, Copland, or Castelnuovo Tedesco, he too aims at transforming the blues. He was deeply rooted in the world of jazz and was close to the African American community, a friend of Harlem jazz pianist J.P. Johnson, as well of the other keyboard giant Fats Waller, and frequently visiting the rap parties that animated Black Manhattan in the roaring 20s. And yet, George Gershwin wrote very few standard 12-bar blues form, especially in his classical works. Blue Monday Blues, from the opera Blue Monday, 1922, is an elaboration of the Blues Not Blues. The same goes for the themes of the Rhapsody in Blue. In a concerto in F, the 12-bar blues form appears 3 times, but on all other occasions, it is dilated or revised. In Porgy and Bess, there are no standard blues form at all. 2 magnificent elaborations of the blues form do, however, appear: Summertime and especially Red-Headed Woman. His brilliant preludes for piano are also in this vein, just like the tender 3/4 blues or the second of the 3 preludes for piano, which Gershwin himself described as a sort of blues lullaby. It sounds like Chopin, Stravinsky, and the blues singer all mixed into one-minute jewel. American musicians were not the only ones interested in the blues. In fact, the spark initially went off far from the States. Let's take a look into how this happened. Going back to Copland's second blues, this piece is dedicated to pianist Andor Foldes, but there's also a second dedication not expressed in the subtitle, Hommage à Mio. This dedication is nevertheless quite perceptible in the music. This passage, with its jazzy rhythm, is built on a specific 8-note scale, the diminished scale. And in this passage in particular, where a pure sando in major arpeggio surfaces from an ambiguous tonal context, are tributes to Darius Milhaud, whom Copland had met and respected in the years when he studied in Paris as a young man. Milhaud is a key figure in our examination of the links between the blues and the classical music. So let's leave the USA and set sail for the old world. But before we leave, we should note one thing. All the composers analyzed so far are Jewish, and in the French capital we will meet Milhaud, another Jewish composer. So there's a Jewish connection that crosses the ocean and brings the 2 continents together. Having taken note of this, we can now set off for Paris, destination Montmartre. Montmartre, which at the end of the 19th century was still a rural area, became the artist district in the new century. Ragtime artists, and later jazz artists, African-American artists. In 1918, Louis Mitchell and his Jazz Kings were based in Paris. This group, at the Casino de Paris, was young Maurice Chevalier's band. The 369th Regiment, with their legendary band, the Hellfighters, led by Jim Europe, were also on French soil. So, while French children were discovering Mickey Mouse and later on Tarzan, Flash Gordon, and Dick Tracy, the French adults went to see Joséphine Baker perform in the variety show Revue Negre. Was orchestra included jazz sax virtuoso Sidney Bechet. Jazz was featured in many music clubs like this one. This is where Maurice Ravel heard jazz for the first time, and in addition to his USA 1928 tour, where he heard Duke Ellington and spent many evenings with George Gershwin, including his own birthday party, this is the setting in which Ravel's bluesy pages were conceived. But in our current discussion of classical Jewish music, Ravel will have to remain on the sidelines. In short, the classical composers of Paris were ravished by the blues, and the first one who came down with this fever was Darius Milhaud. Milhaud loved, I'm quoting, those perfect bluesy chords of Jazz Comfrey. Jazz Comfrey was an American ragtime pianist, and surely enough, in one of his first bluesy compositions, Caramel Mou, which dates to 1920, he included those bluesy chords. But above all, in 1922, during his USA tour, he had the chance to buy records, among which St. Louis Blues and Aunt Haggard's Children Blues. At home, he put this music and the bluesy memories of the concerts he had attended, including the one by the blues singer Ethel Waters, into a classical ballet. This ballet was about creation from the perspective of African mythology and was entitled La Création du Monde. In the ballet, there's a marvelous bluesy fugue, and a few bars before it, we hear the first classic blues in history, written before Gershwin or any American. Let's listen to the Romance movement. We don't find the typical chords spread out over 12 bars, meaning that Milhaud too aimed at a personal reinterpretation of the blues. But let's hear it from Milhaud himself, who, referring to a jazz section of his composition Caramel Mou, said,
The shimmy that you could hear this time, it is perhaps, I would say, the same difference that you have between a photograph and a portrait made by a contemporary painter.
The pages written by Milhaud's friend Alexander Tanzman too are not photos of the blues, but portraits of the blues. A Polish Jew, apart from his childhood, Tanzman lived almost all his life in France. A piano virtuoso, he performed for Hirohito and Gandhi. He was approached by Les Six, the group of six, in particular Milhaud and Honegger, who wanted him to join them, but he preferred to follow his own path. Tanzman wrote more than one composition inspired by the blues, and it was a kind of blues that borrowed a lot from Gershwin. He respected him very deeply. In my opinion, he was the greatest American composer. I met Gershwin in Paris during his first visit there. We became great friends. I introduced Gershwin to Ravel upon my return to New York City. Among Tanzman's most interesting blues, one is included in the second movement of the Sonatine Transatlantique 1930, entitled Spiritual and Blues. It opens with a very solemn spiritual, and then comes the blues, which seems to begin like an improvisation on that spiritual. Meanwhile, the blues had made its way into the conservatory. If I have a regular job as a teacher of jazz history at the conservatory, I owe it in part to a Jewish composer of Hungarian origin whose name was Matthias Seiber. Born in Budapest in 1905, in 1927 he traveled the world playing in a band on a ship. During that tour, which reached the United States, he discovered jazz. He returned to Frankfurt and in 1928 became head of the first jazz department in a conservatory, the Hoch Conservatory in Frankfurt. The course, here is an advertisement, attracted many students. Jazz instruments were taught, such as banjo and sax. Everyone enjoyed the end-of-year recitals. Rhapsody in Blue was played in 1929 end-of-year recital. Some took it badly. "This jazz mania is a plague," thundered a critic in the magazine Musikzeitung. But it was the Nazis who brought this program to a grinding halt. The director of the conservatory, the German Jew Bernhard Sicles, lost his job. He was one of the first Jewish academics to lose his job as soon as Hitler came to power, and the courses were closed in 1933. But Matthias Seiber's music remained. In 1929, he composed a piece called Jazzolette No. 1, full of blues harmonies, and in 1932 he wrote Jazzolette No. 2, in which the blues and 12-tone music come together. The following year, he wrote some rhythmic studies for piano intended for children. One is in blues tempo. Let's listen to a fragment of Jazzolette No. 2, which combines blues and serial music. Seiber left Nazi Germany and became a British citizen in 1935. Victor Ullmann's fate, unfortunately, was quite different. A pianist and composer, Victor Ullmann enlisted in the Austro-Hungarian army at the age of 18. In 1917, he was on the Isonzo front, and he stayed in Trieste in 1917. We see a panorama of Trieste dated 1917. In Trieste, he organized some chamber concerts, so a piece of this composer's life is linked to Italy. He was a very tormented man. He was admitted to a mental institution and had 3 troubled marriages. But the worst was yet to come. In September 1944, Ullmann and his wife were sent to the Terezin ghetto. His second wife and 2 children had already been imprisoned in this ghetto for a few months. Their last-born son, Paul, who was 1 year old, died a few weeks later. Theresienstadt was falsely propagandized by the Nazis as a model ghetto for artists and intellectuals. We see images of a propaganda film shot in Terezin by Jewish actor Kurt Gerron. Gerron was murdered in Auschwitz after filming it. In Terezin, Ullmann wrote sublime music, including the dramatic opera in 1 act, Der Kaiser von Atlantis, the Emperor of Atlantis. The libretto, by the young poet and illustrator Peter Keen, uses a grotesque style to depict a mad emperor who orders the end of the world. One of the characters is Death. This role was interpreted by the bass singer Karel Berman. Berman, as Death, in a twist of fate, was the only member of the cast to survive. All the others died in Auschwitz. And that aria, number 5, is, according to Ullmann's indications, a blues. The composer knew this tradition well. In Terezin, there was an important jazz combo that played blues, the Ghetto Swingers. The clarinet of the Ghetto Swingers, Fritz Weiss, also played in The Kaiser von Atlantis. Weiss was a true virtuoso. When he was killed in Auschwitz, drummer Coco Schumann was present, and in his autobiography, The Ghetto Swingers, he recalled the death of our own Benny Goodman. The death aria, an allegro maestoso blues, is extremely grotesque. That, compared to death's time weapons of destruction, feels all that is useless. So often I raced beside the little horses of Attila as they galloped, and ahead of Hannibal's elephants, but now I'm too tired to follow the motorized legions of fighters. Giuseppe Bruno, pianist, conductor, and director of the Conservatory of La Spezia, who conducted the Kaiser von Atlantis in 2004, talks about this aria, this blues.
This is by far the most important piece of music written in a concentration camp during the Second World War. The reason we are talking about this opera today is that this aria is marked as allegro maestoso blues. What is the relationship of the Czech composer Viktor Ullmann with the blues? If you consider that Ullmann was a former student of Arnold Schoenberg, he was very far from the American culture. But there could be 2 main reasons. One is quite evident, that using, let's say, dance rhythms in an opera could help normal prisoners of the camp to be more closely related with this music. But there is another reason, in my opinion, that is probably deeper. The Casaphone Atlantis is, generally speaking, a big parody of the Nazi regime. The number 6 of the opera, that is the tambourines aria, contains a very powerful parody of the Deutschlandlied. That is quoted in a very distorted way. We can imagine that the blues, this blues, the Death Aria, could be a parody itself of what? Probably of a military march, because the blues is written in 2 or in 4, and it is somehow a march. And in this piece you can hear also, for instance, the trumpet playing very clear military motifs. Similarly to Kurt Weill, the use of an American rhythm was also a way to communicate with people who were not normal concert goers, but in this case were eventually a very special audience, because they were all prisoners. Everybody, the performers and the audience, were sharing the same terrible situation of the concentration camp. And Ullmann was very conscious that he could be someone who could help people to spend those last months of their lives in a more significant way.
And who knows, Ullmann might even have heard the blues in the few hours he spent in Auschwitz before he was killed. Because, to remain in our grotesque vein, music had its place in that living hell. The concentration camp's orchestra was conducted by Polish-Jewish violin player and composer Shimon Laks. Before Auschwitz, Laks wrote at least 2 pieces inspired by the blues, a blues symphonique, which was praised in 1928, and a blues for piano during the same period, of which we can listen to a small segment. A fate not unlike Ullmann's was shared by one of the most important characters in our story, Erwin Schulhoff. A Czech Jew, virtuoso pianist and brilliant composer, like Ullmann, he served in the Austro-Hungarian army, and like Ullmann, he fought on the Isonzo front and was taken prisoner in Italy. And like Ullmann, he died in a concentration camp in 1942. But before his departure, he filled his compositions with the blues. In fact, in 1910, he approached Dadaism. In that period, he wrote, for example, In Futurum, for piano, a score made up of only rests and many expression signs, anticipating John Cage's 433 by 30 years. Or again, the Sonata Erotica for solo female voice, in which a soprano fakes a carefully notated orgasm, 70 years before the film with Harry Mazzelli. In this period, as I was saying, he also fell in love with the ragtime and then with the blues. He not only got to know the blues from the sheet music, but also from the various records lent to him by painter Georg Grosz, a great jazz lover. The first blues by Schulhoff is dated 1926, and it is already a masterpiece. It's a movement from a collection entitled Cinquetude de Jazz. He has studied in France with Claude Debussy, which is expressly dedicated to Paul Whiteman, at the time the world's best-known jazz band leader. Here we see him standing with Maurice Ravel at the piano. Let's listen to this hypnotic, sometimes spooky blues. And the blues also emerges, even if not fully expressed in the title, in the Hot Sonate for alto saxophone and piano 1930. The third movement, lamentuoso ma molto grottesco, is in fact a bizarre 8-bar blues. Once again, this composition is an elaboration, a sublimation of the blues. The final bars of this movement. And it is not easy to interpret these pages, which are classical but also overloaded to a tradition that doesn't come from the world of classical music. Vladimir Horowitz knew this well when he debuted Samuel Barber's Excursions at the Carnegie Hall in 1945. The first two movements of the Excursions are blues. Barber writes, Horowitz says he can't figure out how to play the blues. Returning to the Hot Sonate, we asked Maestro Mario Marzi, saxophonist of the Teatro alla Scala in Milan, and Riccardo Muti, first choice, to show us how a classic blues should be played.
I try to explain what the composer need in this beautiful sonata. He wrote in the beginning lamentuoso and grottesco. So if I play in classical way, maybe I play. So I try to enter much more in the bluesy way, no? With more larger vibrato, more larger glissato, and also when I cut the sound, I use different position with my finger, with my saxophone. For example, in the rhythmical situation, if I play classical, I try the version bluesy with lap and the sound a little bit dirty and the accent in anacrusic. Also, when the composer use the saxophone like a bourdon. I don't play classical long tune like no natural and harmonic way. I use a subtone, with the sound with air inside. And when there is the accent, just not the accent inside the natural way of the phrase in the classical way, much more the accent. For example, if I play normal, the accent, in the jazz way, so it's enough, I think, what I feel of this beautiful sonata. Ciao.
The youngest of the composers imprisoned in the Terezin ghetto was a Czech pianist who was sent to this concentration camp at the age of 22. It was December 1941 and the musician's name was Gideon Klein. Klein brought life to the ghetto by offering a musical education to young people and writing some of his most inspired music, such as the Piano Sonata or his fascinating string trio. In his youth, he studied composition as a self-taught musician and attended a course by Alois Haba, a quarter-tone music composer whose pupils included many Jewish musicians, Ullmann as well. The Czech Haba was not Jewish. Incidentally, Haba also wrote two fascinating blues for piano in 1927. As a tribute to his teacher Haba, Klein wrote a quarter-tone composition. Then he devoted himself to the decaphony, a tonality, in classical counterpoint. Who knows what other paths he might have taken if his life had not ended at the Fürstengruppe camp in January 1945. Gideon was 25 years old. As a young boy, he was an enfant prodige. By the age of 14, he had already written 9 compositions. He certainly also listened to jazz and blues. Two early manuscripts show this. A jazz sketch, which Klein scholar Mina Slavicki dates to around 1936-37, written for piano, violin, sax, and percussion. It is more a tango than a jazz, and a blues for piano. This is only a fragment, but it's enough to understand how well he knew the music of the dedicatee, the jazz pianist Teddy Wilson. Pino Iodice, the jazz composition teacher from the Verdi Conservatory in Milan, will play for us this 1935-38 small unissued segment. Gideon was not much more than a kid when he wrote it, and it's overflowing with adolescent brashness. It's a shame that this voice disappears only after a few bars, just like his life. We can change the past, but we can imagine the future. So I asked Maestro Pino Iodice not only to complete this blues, but also to arrange it for orchestra. Then we found a venue for this music, the prestigious Verdi Hall, where it was played on January 27th on Holocaust Memorial Day. We hope that Gideon, who loved Italy, he had been to Rome, also to Riccione, will forgive us for taking this liberty. Fortunately, not all Jewish composers had to face the infernal conditions of the concentration camps. Darius Milhaud, for example, managed to emigrate to the United States in 1940, and there, in California, teaching at Mills College, he developed a stronger connection with the blues. In his autobiography, My Happy Life, Milhaud mentions one of his pupils and assistants, Howard Brubeck. And Howard was not the only member of the Brubeck family to attend these French composer's courses. The other was his brother Dave Brubeck, one of the most important musicians in jazz history. So let's hear what Dave, who named his son Darius, had to say. Milhaud was an enormous gifted classical composer and teacher who loved jazz and incorporated it into his work. And Dave was not the only one. Several other jazz musicians studied with Milhaud and began to incorporate fugues into their jazz recordings. A similar fate was met by this composer, Stefan Volpe. A Jew and a proud communist, Volpe left Germany in 1934 and found refuge first in Palestine, where he wrote songs for the kibbutzim, and then in the United States. He arrived in New York in 1938. As early as 1926, Volpe wrote one of the most interesting blues out of all the ones discussed in this lecture. Included as the first movement of a suite in two parts entitled Two Dances for Piano, this score is a complete transfiguration of the blues. I'd like to propose a new version of this piece, the Piano Blues orchestrated by Maestro Pino Iodice. This piece was also included in the Holocaust Memorial Day at the Verdi Conservatory. Just like Milhaud, Volpe taught several jazz composers and arrangers in the United States, some of whom were among the most important of their generation. Just to name a few: Gil Evans, Eddie Sauter, Tony Scott, who dedicated his atonal ad-lib blues to him, George Russell, who, without Volpe, couldn't have conceived his jazz blues, and John Carisi. The latter was the dedicatee of the quartet for trumpet, tenor saxophone, percussion, and piano, which Volpe initially conceived for Charlie Parker. And Carisi, the student, returned the favor with his 1948 blues entitled Israel. Carisi probably thought that the blues would be the most fitting tribute to his teacher. And indeed, to the man who began writing blues while Carisi was still in diapers and who was a staunch Zionist, Volpe had worked side by side with Hannah Arendt to support the cause. A blues was probably the most fitting dedication. The blues and the Jews. Do Jews have the right to sing the blues? Jeffrey Melnick has no doubt whatsoever, and he gives the answer in the title of his book, A Right to Sing the Blues, African Americans, Jews and American Popular Songs. His work is part of a huge literature that has explored the relations between Jewish culture, African American culture, and American popular music. The conclusion is quite clear. Not only do they have the right to sing the blues, but they're actually pretty good at it. When Oscar Hammerstein II asked Jerome Kern what kind of music he would write for a musical based on the novel Messer Marco Polo, a story written by an Irishman about an Italian in China, the songwriter replied, "It will be good Jewish music." While the concept of assimilation has been exploited in history, often to justify anti-Semitism, the idea of acculturation, merging one's own culture with other traditions, is very strong in Jewish culture, and this concept can explain much more. But why is it that Jews, out of all musical traditions, have felt a particular affinity for the blues? One thing that many classical composers, Jewish and non-Jewish, may have found in the blues, with its equivocation between major and minor, is that it offers one more way to move beyond the tonal system, in crisis at the time. And the same could be said for the typical inflections of the blues, which were most likely welcome because they fit in well with European microtonal music, which interested several composers, especially Jews. But above and beyond classical music, there is perhaps a general fact that links Jewish music to the blues. These two traditions have similar musical features. And when this is the case, the resulting syncretism could be very powerful. Without going into technicalities, let's go to the piano to listen a couple examples. There is an important scale in Jewish music, the Adonai Malach scale. It's very Jewish, but we can extract from this scale a lot of bluesy phrases. For example, the Adonai Malach scale opens up further reflections on the relation between Jewish religious music and the blues, but unfortunately we don't have enough time to discuss them. Just one example from this area of research which has been investigated by Jack Gottlieb in his Funny It Doesn't Sound Jewish. Let's listen to these two small fragments of music.
Baruch hu et Hashem hamavorach, Baruch et Hashem hamavorach leolam va'ed. It ain't necessarily so. It ain't necessarily so.
From a bar mitzvah prayer to the bluesy It Ain't Necessarily So from Porgy and Bess. And it is no coincidence that George Gershwin's brother Ira, stimulated by such a religious melody, wrote a text on a biblical subject. Let's go back to the piano and consider another scale. The Ukrainian Dorian scale is very Jewish with its oriental feeling, but also very bluesy. example. In these phrases and many others, exactly how much comes from the blues and how much from Jewish scales is very difficult to say, but perhaps we shouldn't even care. What we are really talking about here is a marriage, and in a marriage, what's mine is yours and what's yours is mine, much to the chagrin of divorce lawyers. What's more, this love story between Jewish and blues, which has been going strong for over a century now, doesn't seem to be struggling in the least. It is based on empathy, coming from both sides. On the one hand, a music like the blues, which has managed to bring together Mississippi farmers and classical composers, rockers and jazzmen, Americans and Europeans. And on the other, the Jews, who have been finding ways to reconcile things that seemed incompatible since the dawn of time. And what could be more incompatible than synagogue melodies and African American secular songs mixed together in a classical score? This is the kind of melting pot that Jerome Kern, when planning to compose that musical version of Messer Marco Polo, was simply describing as good Jewish music.